My name is Lila Whitmore, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the daughter who learned how to shrink herself so someone else could take up all the space. I grew up in a house where attention followed my brother like gravity, where his wins were celebrated loudly and his mistakes quietly erased, while mine were either ignored or turned into something inconvenient. In our family, love wasn't something you received equally, it was something you competed for without ever being told the rules. And I learned early that no matter how hard I worked, I was never the one they were waiting for. And the night everything finally became impossible to ignore was the night I stood on a stage holding my future in my hands, while my family walked out before I could even step down. The auditorium lights were so bright they blurred the edges of everything beyond the stage. But I didn't need perfect vision to find them. I already knew exactly where Mom and Dad were sitting, center section, sixth row. The seats they had picked days in advance, as if positioning themselves for the perfect photo mattered more than the moment itself. Lila Whitmore, recipient of the Rutherford Scholarship. The announcement echoed through the room, clear and deliberate, followed by a wave of applause that rose quickly, filling the space with sound, with recognition, with something that should have felt like belonging. I stepped forward, my fingers tightening around the envelope they had just placed in my hand, the embossed lettering catching the light for a brief second before I looked up, instinctively searching for the only reaction that actually mattered to me. I found them immediately, not because they were standing to cheer, because they were already leaving. Dad had one hand on Mason's shoulder, guiding him toward the aisle with the kind of urgency he usually reserved for things that mattered, while Mom was halfway turned away from the stage, her purse already over her arm, her attention no longer in the room at all. Mason stood between them, taller than me now, his expression lit with excitement that didn't belong to this moment but had somehow replaced it anyway. For a fraction of a second, my mind tried to catch up, to explain it away, to find a version of events where this made sense. Maybe someone had called, maybe something urgent had come up. But then I saw Coach Dwyer standing at the end of the row, clapping Mason on the back, laughing, already pulling him into a conversation that looked like celebration. And just like that, the truth settled in. Mason had gotten his call. A last-minute invitation to an elite football camp out in Ohio. The kind recruiters watched closely. The kind Dad had been waiting for since Mason was 15 and started getting real attention. The kind of opportunity that turned into stories people repeated at dinner parties and fundraisers. The kind of moment that, in my family, outweighed everything else. Even this. Ava May. The applause around me continued. Steady and loud. But it felt distant now. Like it belonged to a different version of the night. One where my parents were still sitting in their seats, watching me, proud in the way I had imagined so many times that it almost felt like a memory instead of a fantasy. But that version didn't exist. Not here. Not tonight. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look back. Mom smiled at someone near the aisle. Dad said something that made Mason laugh. And then they stepped out through the side doors beneath the exit sign, disappearing into the hallway while my name was still hanging in the air. I stood there for a second, longer than I should have. Long enough for the principal to shift slightly beside me. Long enough for the photographer to gesture for me to move forward. Long enough for the moment to fracture into something that no longer felt like mine. Then I walked. Across the stage. Through the line. Into the next version of the night where everything continued as if nothing had happened. I shook hands I barely registered. Smiled for photos that would later circulate online with captions about achievement and dedication. Accepted congratulations from teachers and parents who had watched more of my life than my own family ever had. And all the while, there was a quiet, steady awareness settling into place inside me, not loud, not dramatic, just precise. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. By the time the ceremony ended, the auditorium had shifted into celebration mode, families flooding the aisles, flowers appearing from nowhere, cameras flashing, voices rising and overlapping as people called out names, pulled each other into hugs, captured moments that would be framed and remembered and revisited. I moved toward the edge of the stage, scanning the crowd one more time even though I already knew what I would find. Nothing. No familiar faces. No one waving me over. No one waiting. My phone buzzed in my hand. Mason made camp. We're taking him to Sullivan's. Don't make this a scene. Mom. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Completely. In a way that removed any space for denial. No congratulations. No apology. No question about where I was. Just instruction. Don't make this a scene. Around me, someone's father lifted his daughter off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down, both of them laughing in that unguarded way that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're supposed to be, with the people who are supposed to be there with you. I turned away before I had to watch any more of it. Outside, the evening air was thick and warm, the kind that clung to your skin and made everything feel heavier than it already was. The parking lot stretched out under the glow of overhead lights, mostly empty now. The sound of cicadas filling the silence left behind by the crowd. My car sat alone near the edge, exactly where I had left it that morning. No flowers on the hood, no card under the windshield, no one waiting beside it. I opened the door and sat down slowly, placing the envelope on the passenger seat, my fingers lingering on it for a second before I pulled it back into my lap and opened it again, more carefully this time, as if the details inside might shift if I wasn't paying close enough attention. Full tuition. Housing. 4 years. A letter that spoke about potential, discipline, vision, words that had never been used for me at home, not in a way that mattered. I let out a slow breath, staring at the page as something settled into place inside me. Not as anger. Not yet. But as clarity that felt sharper than anything I had experienced before. Because this wasn't the first time. It was just the clearest. There had been other moments, smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss if I tried hard enough. The winter showcase where Dad left halfway through my performance because Mason had a scrimmage across town. The emergency room visit after I slipped on black ice, where Mom spent most of the drive complaining about how inconvenient the timing was for Mason's recruiting dinner. My 17th birthday, when the family celebration turned into an announcement about Mason making first-string captain, and the cake with my name on it never made it out of the kitchen because Mom said it would confuse the guests. There had always been a reason, always something more important, always a version of the story where I was expected to understand. But sitting there in that quiet parking lot, still wearing a gown no one had stayed to see, holding proof that I had built something on my own, something real, something undeniable, I realized that none of it had ever been accidental. This wasn't oversight. This was design. In my family, Mason was the future, and I was the adjustment. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't convince myself that it would ever be different. When I pushed the front door open, the first thing that hit me wasn't the smell of steak or the hum of the dishwasher, it was the sound of laughter, full and effortless, like nothing in the world had gone wrong tonight. For a moment I stood there in the doorway, still in my graduation gown, listening, not hesitating, not gathering courage, just listening long enough to understand exactly what I was walking into. I'm serious. Coach said this could change everything. Mason's voice carried from the dining room, bright with excitement, already expanding into something bigger than the moment itself. There'll be scouts there. Real ones. Dad's reply came immediately, warm, satisfied, proud in a way that filled the space. That's what happens when you stay focused. Mom followed without missing a beat. We always knew you would get here. Of course they did. They had always known where he was going. They had just never cared where I might end up. I stepped further inside, the soft fabric of my gown brushing against the hardwood floor. And as I turned into the kitchen, the entire scene came into focus with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if this was the version of the night they had chosen to preserve. Takeout containers from Sullivan's were spread across the table, half-finished steaks, folded napkins, a bottle of red wine sitting open near Dad's elbow, and at the center of it all, a cake with bright blue icing that read "Congrats Mason" in uneven white letters. Already cut into. Already celebrated. To the side, near the fruit bowl, my graduation photo packet lay bent under a stack of grocery flyers, like something that had accidentally ended up in the wrong place and hadn't been worth fixing. No one had even tried to hide it. 3 faces turned toward me. Mom's expression shifted first, tightening just slightly, not into guilt but into control, like she was already preparing to manage whatever came next. Dad leaned back in his chair, his posture changing in that subtle way that meant he was bracing for resistance. while Mason glanced at me briefly before looking away again, his attention already returning to what mattered to him. "There you are," Mom said. The words were simple, almost casual. But there was something in the way she said them that made it clear this was not a moment she intended to expand. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. Just placement. I stood there for a second, taking in the table, the cake, the empty space where I had never been expected to sit. And then I looked back at them, feeling something inside me settle, not emotion. Not yet, but something steadier, something more deliberate. "You said you wouldn't miss it," I said. My voice even, controlled in a way that came from years of practice rather than calm. Mom exhaled softly, the sound carrying disappointment more than concern. "Lila, don't start." The phrase landed exactly where it always did, shifting the focus away from what had happened and onto how I was reacting. As if the problem had just entered the room with me. "Don't start." As if I had created the moment instead of living through it. Dad reached for his glass without looking at me, his tone already closing the conversation before it had begun. "Tonight is not about you." There was a brief pause after that, the kind that stretches just long enough for something to become permanent. "I got a full scholarship," I said, placing the words into the room carefully. Not as a challenge, but as a fact that deserved space. Even here. Mason let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, shaking his head slightly. "Yeah, we know." He didn't look at me when he said it. Mom stepped closer, her movements smooth, controlled, her expression softening into something that might have looked like patience to someone who didn't know her. "And we are proud of you," she said, choosing her words with precision, as if the sentence itself could resolve everything. "But this," she gestured lightly toward Mason, "this is different." The word lingered. Different. Different how? I asked, not raising my voice, not pushing too hard, just asking the question they were trying not to answer. Dad finally looked at me then, his expression tightening slightly, his tone shifting into explanation without accountability. "Mason's opportunity affects his future in a way that mine doesn't," I said, finishing the sentence he was carefully avoiding. Silence cut through the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but sharp enough to be felt. Mom's voice changed instantly. "Watch your tone." There it was. Not what I said. How I said it. Always. I stepped forward and placed the scholarship envelope on the counter between us, flattening it gently, as if its presence alone might force the reality into the room in a way they could not ignore. "You left before my name was even finished," I said, my voice steady, controlled, because I knew better than to let emotion become evidence against me. "We didn't leave," Mom replied quickly. "We stepped out. You didn't come back." Mason shifted in his chair, irritation flickering across his face now that the conversation refused to disappear on its own. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" I looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, I understood that from his perspective, nothing unusual had happened, because this was how things had always worked. "Because it was," I said. Dad set his glass down harder than necessary, the sound small but decisive. "No," he said, his voice flattening. "You're turning it into one." Mom stepped closer again, lowering her voice slightly, shifting the tone from public to private as if that would make it more reasonable. "Lila, you're smart," she said. "You're going to be fine no matter what. Mason needs this more." Needs. The word settled into the center of everything, reshaping the moment, rewriting the past, justifying the pattern in a single breath. I held her gaze. "So I matter less because I don't need you as much?" "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you meant." Dad stood up then, his chair scraping against the floor, his presence filling the space in a way that had ended every argument in this house for as long as I could remember. "We are not having this conversation," he said, his voice low, controlled, final. "We're already having it." His eyes hardened. "Then we're ending it." Mom reached for my wrist, her fingers closing gently but firmly around it. A gesture that looked like comfort but functioned like control, grounding me in place just enough to redirect me without making it obvious. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "This family works because we support each other. For a second, the word almost felt unreal. Support. That's not support, I said. That's choosing. Her grip tightened slightly. No, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. That's prioritizing. And just like that, everything aligned. Not as confusion, not as misunderstanding, but as structure. This wasn't something that had happened to me. This was something that had been built around me. Dad shook his head, dismissing it. You're being emotional. Mason leaned back in his chair, already disengaging. Can we just eat? And in that moment, everything became simple. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to acknowledge what they had done. They weren't even going to pretend it mattered. They were going to move on. And I was expected to follow. Mom released my wrist slowly, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve as if restoring order. Go change, she said softly. We'll talk about this later. Later. A word that had never once meant what it promised. I didn't move, because something inside me had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, like a line drawn too deeply to erase. I looked at the table, at the cake with his name, at the empty space that had never been mine, at the envelope resting between us like evidence no one intended to examine. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to fit into a version of this family that had already decided who I was supposed to be. They weren't asking me to understand. They were asking me to disappear. And this time, I wasn't sure I was willing to. The moment I realized nothing in that house was ever going to change didn't come from something they said, it came from how easily they stopped talking about it at all. Dinner resumed. Not gradually, not awkwardly, not with any attempt to repair what had just happened, but cleanly, as if someone had pressed a reset button the second I stopped pushing back, and within minutes the conversation shifted right back to Mason's camp. His schedule, his future, his next steps, his opportunities, his needs. My existence folded out of the room without anyone needing to acknowledge it. I stood there a second longer than necessary, watching it happen in real time, watching how quickly I could be replaced by a story that felt more important, more exciting, more worth their attention. And that was when something inside me stopped trying to fight for space. Because this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the system. And I had finally seen it clearly enough to understand that no amount of effort on my part was going to rewrite it. I picked up the scholarship envelope from the counter, smoothing the corner they had bent earlier, and without saying anything else, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, and into my room, the one place in the house that had ever really belonged to me, even if only in the smallest possible way. The door closed behind me with a soft click. No one followed. No one called my name. No one even paused long enough to notice that I was gone. I stood there in the middle of my room, still in my graduation gown, staring at the space I had spent years growing inside, books stacked along the wall, debate trophies lined carefully on a shelf no one ever dusted, college brochures taped inside my closet door, notes and schedules and plans layered on top of each other like proof that I had been preparing for something bigger long before anyone else had taken me seriously. For a long time I had believed that if I worked hard enough, if I became good enough, if I proved myself clearly enough, they would eventually see me. That there would be a moment, a single moment, where everything balanced out. Tonight had been that moment. And they had still chosen him. The realization didn't break me. It settled. Slow. Precisi. Final. I walked over to my desk and sat down. The wood cool under my hands. The room suddenly quieter than it had ever felt before. Not because there was no sound, but because something inside me had stopped waiting for it. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up, casting a soft glow across the desk, reflecting faintly in the glass of the framed certificate I had printed weeks earlier. The one confirming my acceptance into Columbia. The one I had imagined showing them, handing to them, watching their reaction as they finally understood what I had done. I hadn't shown them yet. I had been waiting for the right moment. There wasn't one. There had never been one. I clicked into my email. Unread messages. Scholarship confirmations. Financial aid breakdowns. A message from the Rutherford Foundation marked urgent. flagged 2 days earlier while I was working a late shift at the pharmacy and hadn't had time to open it properly. I clicked. The email loaded slowly, the subject line sharp against the screen. Final confirmation required. Placement and early research track. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Slower. They were offering me something more. An early placement into a research program, competitive, selective, limited spots starting before the official semester, with additional funding, housing already arranged, and a required move-in date. In less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Not in the fall. Not later. Now. There was a line near the bottom, simple, direct. We require confirmation within 48 hours to secure your position. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the words settling into me in a way that felt different from everything else that had happened that night. Because this wasn't about them. This wasn't something they could ignore, redirect, or minimize. This was a door. And it was open. For a long time, I had told myself that leaving would be complicated, that I needed to explain it properly, that I needed their support, their approval, their understanding, that I needed to transition carefully so that nothing felt broken, nothing felt abrupt, nothing felt like I was walking away instead of being pushed. But sitting there in that quiet room, with their voices drifting faintly up from downstairs, still laughing, still celebrating, still building a future that did not include me unless I made myself smaller to fit into it, I realized something that felt both terrifying and strangely calm at the same time. I didn't need to wait for them. I didn't need permission. I didn't even need a conversation. The timeline in front of me was clear. 48 hours. 3 weeks. A new life that had already been offered to me before I had fully understood what I was allowed to take. My phone buzzed again on the desk. I glanced down. Mom, come downstairs. We're cutting the cake. I stared at the message for a moment, imagining the scene below, the same table, the same laughter, the same careful arrangement of attention, the same expectation that I would walk back in, smile, sit down, and pretend that nothing had shifted inside me in a way that could not be undone. For years I would have gone down. I would have apologized. I would have adjusted. I would have made it easier. But now, I looked back at the email on my screen, at the deadline, at the words that had been written by people who had never met me in person, but had still seen enough to offer me something real. And for the first time, the choice in front of me didn't feel impossible. It felt simple. I picked up my phone and turned it face down. Then I leaned forward, placed my fingers on the keyboard, and began typing. I accept. The words appeared on the screen, small, quiet, but heavier than anything I had ever said out loud in that house. I hesitated for half a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Not just leaving for school, leaving the version of myself that had been waiting for them to catch up. Then I hit send. The email disappeared. And with it, something else. Not pain, not anger, just the expectation that things would ever be different if I stayed exactly where I was. Downstairs, I could still hear them laughing. Upstairs, for the first time in my life, I felt something else entirely. Not relief, not yet, but direction. And once you know where you're going, you don't need anyone to tell you to leave. The first night I slept in my new apartment, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. Not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. The kind of silence that feels unfamiliar. When your body has spent years learning how to listen for footsteps, voices, doors opening, and the subtle shifts in tone that meant you were about to be called, corrected, or dismissed. I lay still on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where the streetlight leaked through the uneven blinds in pale stripes. And for a few seconds, I didn't move because I was waiting for something that wasn't coming anymore, waiting for the low murmur of my parents' voices downstairs, for the sudden rise of Mason's laughter, for the sound of my name spoken from another room in a way that always meant I needed to adjust myself before I answered. Nothing came. Just the hum of an old refrigerator and the distant echo of a car passing somewhere far below. And in that silence, something settled in a way that felt heavier than anything I had carried before. Because it wasn't pressure anymore. It was space. And I hadn't yet learned how to exist inside it without filling it with memories that no longer had a place here. The apartment was smaller than anything I had ever called home. A narrow rectangle of space just off Amsterdam Avenue, with walls that showed their age in faint cracks near the corners, and a kitchenette that barely fit a single person at a time. But it was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. And that ownership came with a kind of responsibility that no one had prepared me for. There was no one to fall back on here, no one to redirect blame toward, no one to decide whether I was doing enough. Every choice, every mistake, every success belonged entirely to me. And while that should have felt empowering, it also meant there was nowhere to hide when things became difficult. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around my shoulders as I looked around the room, taking in the small details that had begun to form the outline of a life I was still learning how to build: the stack of books against the wall, the unopened box labeled kitchen, the single chair by the window, the scholarship letter folded carefully on the desk like something fragile but permanent. For years, I had imagined leaving as a kind of escape, a clean break that would immediately feel lighter, easier, freer. But the reality was more complicated than that, because freedom, without structure, forces you to confront yourself in ways that dependence never does. I wasn't just free from them. I was fully responsible for myself. And that realization came with weight. The next morning began before I felt ready for it, the alarm cutting through the quiet with a sharpness that forced me upright before I could think too much about how little I had slept. And as I moved through the apartment, making instant coffee in a chipped mug I had picked up from a discount store, I found myself watching the street below as the city came to life with a kind of urgency I had never experienced back home. People moved quickly, purposefully, without hesitation. No one waited. No one slowed down to accommodate someone else's expectations. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to exist in a place where attention was not assigned, it had to be earned. And even then, it was temporary. Classes started that day. And from the moment I stepped into the building, it was clear that this environment operated on a completely different set of rules than anything I had known before, because there was no adjustment for potential here, no softening of expectations to protect someone's confidence, only a direct and unfiltered demand for performance. Professor Alden didn't introduce himself with warmth or encouragement, but with a statement that landed harder than anything my parents had ever said. Precisely because it carried no bias, no preference, no hidden agenda. "You're here because someone thinks you're capable of more than average," he said, pacing slowly across the front of the room, his eyes moving from one student to the next. "That doesn't mean you are. It means you might be. The rest is up to you." There was no applause after that, no reassurance, no one telling me I was special. And instead of feeling dismissed, I felt something shift into place, because for the first time, I wasn't being compared to anyone else in the room. I was being measured against what I could actually do. The days that followed demanded more than I thought I had to give, stretching into a rhythm that left little room for hesitation, with long hours in lectures, even longer hours in the lab, and nights spent reviewing material until the words blurred together, and the lines between effort and exhaustion became difficult to separate. Money became its own constant calculation, a quiet pressure that followed me through every decision. From the groceries I could afford to the number of subway rides I could justify in a week, forcing me to become precise in a way that had nothing to do with academics and everything to do with survival. Within the first week, I took a job at a small cafe 2 blocks from campus, working evening shifts that ran late enough to blur into night, learning how to move quickly behind the counter, how to remember orders without writing them down, how to smile just enough to earn tips without inviting conversation. I didn't have the energy to maintain. There were nights when I didn't get back to my apartment until after midnight, my hands still smelling like coffee and sugar, my feet aching from hours of standing, and my mind still trying to process concepts I hadn't fully understood earlier in the day. And in those moments, the absence of anyone waiting for me became more noticeable than it had during the day. Not painful, but present. Loneliness didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, in small, specific moments that were easy to ignore individually but impossible to dismiss when they started to connect: the empty chair across from me during meals, the lack of a familiar voice at the end of a long day, the quiet walk back to my apartment when the city was still loud but no longer felt shared. And yet, every time the thought of going back crossed my mind, it dissolved almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something steadier, something that had taken shape the night I chose to leave without asking for permission. "This is what it costs," And more importantly, this is what it gives. Because alongside the exhaustion, the isolation, and the constant pressure to keep moving forward, something else began to grow. Something that didn't rely on anyone else's recognition to exist. I learned how to trust my own decisions without waiting for validation. I learned how to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to fix it. I learned that progress didn't need to be visible to be real. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm that had once felt overwhelming began to settle into something more controlled. Not because it became easier, but because I became stronger inside it, more capable of carrying the weight without questioning whether I should. One night, near the end of the first term, I stayed late in the lab, long after most of the others had left, working through a problem that had taken me days to fully understand, adjusting variables, testing outcomes, pushing past the point where frustration would have once made me stop. The building was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty, and as I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, I became aware of the difference between the silence I had grown up with and the silence I had created here. One had been filled with expectation, the other held possibility. And in that difference, I understood something that had been forming beneath everything else I had been experiencing, something that did not arrive as a sudden realization, but as a quiet certainty that no longer needed to be questioned. I wasn't just surviving the life I had chosen. I was becoming someone who no longer needed to be chosen at all. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The first time my name appeared on a screen that didn't belong to a classroom, it was projected 12 feet high in a glass-walled conference hall in Lower Manhattan. And for a moment I didn't recognize it, not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had never seen it placed somewhere that carried that kind of weight. Lead analyst, Lila Whitmore. The letters were clean, centered, undeniable, sitting beneath a title that had taken me months to build toward, and as I stood at the edge of the stage waiting to be introduced, I felt something shift inside me that was different from anything I had experienced before. Not relief, not validation, but a quiet recognition that the work I had done in silence had finally reached a place where it could no longer be ignored. The room was full, not with parents, not with people who had known me growing up, but with investors, researchers, executives, and journalists, people who had no reason to care about me beyond what I could deliver, which somehow made their attention feel more real than anything I had ever received at home. I adjusted the sleeve of my blazer, grounding myself in the present moment, letting the weight of the past settle behind me where it belonged. And when the moderator finally called my name, I stepped forward without hesitation. No searching for faces, no waiting for approval, just movement. The presentation itself had started as a late-night idea during my second term, a way to model small-scale financial instability across urban households, using fragmented datasets that most people ignored because they didn't fit cleanly into traditional analysis frameworks. It had taken months to refine, weeks of testing, revisions that stretched late into the night, and more failed attempts than I could count. But somewhere along the way, the pieces had started to align into something that felt solid, something that worked. By the time I reached the center of the stage, the first slide had already shifted behind me, the opening lines of my model displayed in precise detail, and as I began to speak, I realized that the nerves I had expected never came. Because this space didn't ask me to shrink, didn't require me to adjust, didn't measure me against anyone else's expectations. It simply responded to what I brought into it. I explained the structure, the limitations, the breakthrough. Questions came quickly, sharper than anything I had faced before, but instead of feeling threatened by them, I found myself leaning into them, answering without hesitation, clarifying without defensiveness, holding my ground in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Because here, being challenged wasn't a sign that I was failing. It was proof that I was being taken seriously. When it ended, the applause wasn't overwhelming, wasn't exaggerated, but it was steady, intentional, and more importantly, it was earned. People approached afterward, some asking about the model, others about collaboration, a few about funding possibilities, and for the first time, I moved through a crowd without searching for someone to anchor myself to, without waiting for a familiar voice to tell me where to stand or what to say. I didn't need it. I had built something that spoke for me. Later that evening, after the room had emptied and the lights had dimmed, I stepped outside onto the street, the city still moving around me in that constant, unfiltered way that had once felt overwhelming and now felt like part of the rhythm I had learned to match. My phone buzzed in my hand. I almost ignored it. Not out of fear, out of a bit. But something about the timing made me glance down. A notification. Not from work. Not from school. From a number I hadn't saved but didn't need to. Mom. There was no message preview. Just a missed call. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, not because it unsettled me, but because it didn't nod in the way it used to. Not with the same immediate pull that would have once made me stop everything and respond without thinking. Another notification appeared. A text this time. We saw you online. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the link attached beneath it. A clip. Short. 30 seconds. My presentation. Edited. Shared. Viewed thousands of times already. The caption read, "Young researcher reshapes financial risk modeling, watch this." I watched it once. Not for validation, not for confirmation, but for perspective. Seeing myself from the outside in a way that felt almost detached, like I was observing someone I had only recently become. Confident, focused, unapologetic. There was no hesitation in my voice, no adjustment in my posture, no trace of the person who had once stood on a stage searching for approval that never came. When the clip ended, I closed it without replaying. The phone remained in my hand for a moment, the message still visible on the screen. We saw you. Not we're proud of you. Not we're sorry. Just acknowledgement. Recognition without ownership. I slipped the phone back into my bag. Because for the first time, it didn't feel like something I needed to respond to. The next few weeks moved quickly. Opportunities unfolding in ways I hadn't planned for but had prepared myself to handle. Conversations turning into meetings into offers, each step building on the last in a way that felt structured, intentional, earned. I moved into a better apartment. Not large, not extravagant, but stable, clean. Mine. I reduced my hours at the cafe, replacing them with paid research work that aligned with what I had been building. The shift subtle on the outside but significant in what it represented. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was advancing. And with every step forward, the distance between who I had been in that house and who I was becoming here grew wider. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like a line extending beyond a point that could no longer be traced back easily. One evening, as I sat by the window of my new place, reviewing notes for an upcoming panel discussion, I caught my reflection faintly in the glass, layered over the city lights outside. And for a second, I paused not to question it, not to doubt it, but to recognize it, because the person looking back at me wasn't waiting anymore, wasn't adjusting, wasn't asking. She was choosing, and the difference between those two versions of myself was not defined by what I had achieved, but by what I no longer needed to prove. Down the street, traffic moved in steady lines. People passing each other without hesitation, without attachment, each one carrying their own direction, their own purpose, their own weight. I watched them for a moment longer, then turned back to my work, the quiet of the room settling around me in a way that felt familiar now, not empty, not heavy, but grounded. Because this life, everything inside it, the struggle, the growth, the success had been built without permission, and that made it something no one else could take away. The first time I saw them again, it wasn't in a place that belonged to them. It was in a room that had been built for people like me. The conference hall was brighter than I remembered, filled with the low, steady hum of conversation that always came before something important began. And as I stood near the side of the stage, reviewing my notes for the panel, I felt the familiar rhythm settle into place, the quiet focus, the controlled breathing, the awareness that whatever happened next would be determined by what I brought into the room, not by who was watching. I had just been introduced as one of the keynote speakers. Not a student. Not a participant. A speaker. The title still felt new in a way I hadn't fully processed. But I had learned not to question it while I was standing inside it. Because hesitation had a way of pulling you backward if you let it stay too long. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer and glanced briefly toward the audience, letting my eyes move across the rows without attaching to any single face, the way I had trained myself to do when the room mattered more than the people inside it. And then I saw them. Not in the front. Not in the center. But close enough that there was no mistaking it. Mom sat upright, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged in a way I knew too well, the version of her that appeared in public spaces where image mattered more than truth. Dad sat beside her, shoulders squared, scanning the room like he was evaluating it, while Mason leaned back slightly, his presence less contained, less practiced, but still unmistakably there. For a moment, everything slowed, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted what I was doing, but just enough for the recognition to settle into something real. They hadn't come to support me. They had come to see what I had become, and more importantly, what they could do with it. I didn't look at them again, because I didn't need to. The version of me that would have searched for their reaction, that would have adjusted her voice or posture or presence based on what she thought they might feel, no longer existed in this room. When my name was called, I stepped forward. The lights caught the stage in a clean, even glow, the audience quieting almost immediately, attention shifting in a way that felt controlled, intentional, earned. And as I began to speak, I focused on the work, on the structure, on the message I had come here to deliver, letting everything else fall away. The presentation moved smoothly. Questions came, sharper than before, more direct, more demanding. But I met them without hesitation, holding my ground in a way that no longer required effort, because I wasn't proving anything. I was explaining something I understood completely. At one point, I noticed movement in the audience. Dad leaning forward, Mom whispering something to him. Mason glancing down at his phone, but it didn't pull me off balance, didn't interrupt the flow, didn't reach me in the way it once would have. Because their presence here didn't change anything. It didn't define the moment. It didn't define me. When it ended, the applause was steady, measured, the kind that followed clarity rather than spectacle. And as I stepped off the stage, I didn't look toward them. I didn't need to. They found me. Of course they did. I was halfway through a conversation with one of the panel organizers when I felt it, that subtle shift in the air that came from someone stepping into your space with the expectation that you would immediately recognize them. Lila. Mom's voice. Controlled. Soft. Public. I turned slowly. She was smiling, but not the way she used to at home, not the effortless version she reserved for Mason, but something more calculated, something that belonged to the environment we were standing in. That was impressive, she said. Dad nodded once, his expression neutral but attentive. You've done well. Mason stood slightly behind them, his arms crossed, his gaze moving over me in a way that felt less dismissive than before, but not quite respectful either. More like he was trying to recalibrate something he hadn't expected to change. I waited, because I knew this wasn't the point. Mom stepped closer. We've been meaning to reach out, she continued, her tone careful, measured, like she was stepping onto unfamiliar ground and didn't want to lose control of it. Things have been busy. Bozu. I let the word pass without reacting. Dad took over, as he always did when the conversation needed direction. We saw your work online, he said. There's a lot of interest. That's how conferences usually work. He didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, he shifted slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal that what came next was more important than everything else. We're restructuring some things, he said. Expanding the firm. There's an opportunity here if you're willing to be part of it. There it was. Not pride. Not apology. An opportunity. For them. Mom nodded quickly. Your father thinks your model could be adapted, she added. There's real potential if it's applied correctly, and with the right backing. With the right ownership, Dad corrected smoothly. The word landed quietly. Ownership. I looked at him. Really looked this time. Not as a daughter, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone evaluating a proposal. And what exactly would that look like? I asked. He didn't hesitate. You come in under the firm, he said. We handle the business side. You focus on development. It's efficient, strategic. And the model? It becomes part of the company. Of course it did. Mom stepped in again, her tone softening, almost persuasive. This is how these things work, Lila. You don't have to do everything on your own anymore. On your own. The phrase lingered. Not as concern. As leverage. Mason shifted slightly, finally speaking. It's a good deal, he said. You'd be stupid not to take it. I turned to him briefly, noting the confidence in his voice. The assumption that the answer was obvious. That the dynamic hadn't actually changed as much as it looked from the outside. Then I looked back at my parents. At the way they stood. At the way they framed it. At the way they had arrived not to reconnect, but to reposition. And in that moment, I understood the full shape of what they were asking. Not for me to come back. For me to be useful. Mom smiled again, just slightly. We're offering you a way to scale this properly. I held her gaze. And for the first time, there was no pressure behind it. No weight. No expectation that I needed to adjust myself to meet it. Because this wasn't the same conversation anymore. And I wasn't the same person sitting across from it. The moment I realized I wasn't afraid of them anymore didn't arrive with anger or raised voices, it arrived quietly. In the space between what they expected me to say and what I chose not to. For years, every conversation with them had followed the same pattern. A structure so familiar I could have predicted every word before it was spoken. Mom softening the tone. Dad defining the terms. Mason reinforcing the outcome until eventually I adjusted, agreed, or stepped back. Not because I believed them, but because I had been trained to keep the peace even when it cost me everything. But standing there in that conference hall, with people moving around us, with conversations continuing just close enough to be overheard, with the echo of my own presentation still lingering in the room, I understood something that made all of that structure irrelevant. They didn't have control here. Not over the room, not over the outcome, and not over me. I looked at my father first, letting the silence stretch just long enough to shift the balance of the conversation, forcing him to sit inside the space he had created instead of filling it the way he always had. You want ownership, I said. My voice even. Not confrontational. Not defensive. Just precise. He didn't deny it. It's the logical move. Logical for who? His expression didn't change. But there was a slight pause this time. A recalibration that hadn't been there before. For everyone involved, I nodded once, as if I was considering it, even though the answer had already settled into place long before he finished speaking. And what happens to my name? I asked. Mom stepped in quickly, her tone smoothing the edges. Your name stays attached, of course. This is your work. Attached. Not owned. Not protected. Just placed. And the rights? I continued, holding her gaze this time. Dad answered. They transfer under the firm. That's standard. Of course it was. Mason shifted beside them, his voice cutting in with a kind of impatience that hadn't changed, even if the situation had. You're overthinking it, he said. This is bigger than you. I turned to him slowly, not reacting to the words themselves, but to the assumption behind them, the belief that nothing fundamental had changed, that I was still the version of myself who would shrink under pressure and accept whatever was framed as best. This is exactly as big as me, I said. The sentence didn't land loudly, but it didn't need to. There was a brief silence after that, not because they didn't understand what I meant, but because they did. And for the first time, the usual responses didn't fit as easily as they once had. Mom tried again, adjusting her approach, softening her tone even further. Lila, we're trying to help you, she said, lowering her voice slightly, as if making the moment more private would make it more persuasive. You don't have to carry everything on your own anymore. The words might have worked once. They might have reached the version of me who believed that support was something I needed to earn, who believed that independence was a burden rather than a choice. But now, they sounded different. Not like help, like access. I let out a small breath, not in frustration, but in recognition. Because the pattern was so clear now that it almost felt predictable, like watching something unfold exactly the way it always had, except this time, I wasn't standing inside it. I didn't carry everything on my own because I wanted to, I said, my voice still steady, still controlled. I did it because you made it clear I had to. Mom's expression flickered for a second. The smallest break in the version of herself she was holding together for the room around us. That's not fair, she said quickly. No, I replied. It wasn't. Dad stepped forward slightly, his presence tightening, his voice lowering into something more direct. This isn't about the past, he said. This is about what makes sense now. It is about the past, I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Because the only reason you're standing here asking for this is because of what I built without you. That was the moment the conversation shifted. Not dramatically, not explosively, but enough. Around us, a few conversations had quieted. Not entirely, but just enough that I could feel the edges of attention beginning to turn. The subtle awareness that something more than a casual exchange was happening. Mom noticed it too. Of course she did. Her posture adjusted slightly, her voice lowering further, her words becoming more careful, more contained. We don't need to do this here, she said. But I didn't move, because for the first time I understood that the location mattered. Not for me. For them. This is exactly where it needs to happen, I said. Dad's expression hardened. Not outwardly, but in the way his silence changed. The way he stopped trying to guide the conversation and started trying to contain it. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said. No, I replied. I'm making it clear. There was another pause. Longer this time. And in that pause, everything that had once held power over me, expectation, pressure, obligation, lost its weight completely. Because none of it applied here. None of it applied anymore. I'm not giving you my work, I said. The words were simple, unforced. Final. Mom inhaled sharply, just enough for it to be noticeable if you were paying attention. And for a moment, I saw something real in her expression, something unfiltered, something that didn't belong to the version of her she presented to the world. Lila, she started. I didn't let her finish. And I'm not joining your firm, I continued, my voice still calm, still even, because this wasn't about emotion anymore. I built this on my own, and I'm keeping it that way. Mason let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You're seriously walking away from this? I looked at him, holding his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not to challenge him, but to make sure he understood exactly what was being said. I already did, I answered. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything they hadn't expected. Full of a version of me they hadn't prepared for. Full of a reality where I no longer needed to negotiate my place in a system that had never been built for me. Mom's voice, when it came again, was quieter. We're your family. The statement hung there. Not as comfort, not as truth, but as a final attempt to anchor me to something that had once defined me. I considered it for a moment. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood what it used to mean. Then I nodded slightly. I know, I said. And then, just as calmly, that doesn't change anything. I stepped back. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the conversation was over. That there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix, because the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, long before it. And as I turned away, walking back toward the room, toward the people who were still discussing ideas instead of ownership, collaboration instead of control, I felt something settle into place with a clarity that didn't need to be reinforced. I hadn't just refused them. I had stepped out of the role they had written for me, and I wasn't going back. The moment it finally became clear to me that I didn't need them anymore, didn't feel like victory. It felt like quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows conflict, or the heavy stillness that comes after something breaks, but something steadier. Something that didn't demand anything from me. Something that simply existed without asking to be filled. I stepped back into the conference room, the low hum of conversation folding around me again. People moving between small groups, continuing discussions that had nothing to do with what had just happened a few steps away. And for the first time, I didn't feel split between two versions of myself, the one who belonged here and the one who had been shaped somewhere else. There was only one. And she didn't hesitate. Someone approached me with a question about the model. Another asked about a potential collaboration. A third handed me a card, mentioning a follow-up meeting. I responded, engaged, moved through each interaction with the same steady focus I had learned to build over the past months. Not as a performance, not as a way to prove anything, but because this was simply how I operated now present, clear, and grounded in what I knew I could do. At one point, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass wall near the back of the room, layered over the city lights outside, and for a second, I paused not to question it, not to compare it to who I had been, but to recognize it. Because the person looking back at me didn't carry the weight of being overlooked. She didn't adjust her presence to make room for someone else. She didn't wait for recognition before allowing herself to take up space. She existed fully, without negotiation, and that difference wasn't something that had been given to me. It was something I had built, piece by piece, decision by decision, in moments no one had witnessed, and no one had validated except me. My phone buzzed in my bag. Once, then again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. There had been a time when that sound would have pulled my attention immediately, when I would have stepped away, answered quickly, adjusted my tone before speaking, prepared myself to respond in a way that kept everything smooth, everything manageable, everything intact. That time had passed. I reached into my bag slowly, not out of urgency, but out of choice. And when I looked at the screen, the notifications confirmed exactly what I expected. Missed call. Another message. We need to talk. The words sat there, familiar in structure, familiar in tone, carrying the same weight they always had. The same implication that something unresolved needed to be addressed, that something required my attention, my response, my involvement. But this time, the meaning didn't hold, because there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to fix. I stared at the message for a moment, not because I was considering it, but because I was recognizing how different it felt now, how the absence of urgency revealed something that had always been there, but had never been clear enough for me to name. They didn't need to talk, they needed access. And I was no longer available. I locked the screen and placed the phone back into my bag, the motion simple, unforced, final in a way that didn't require reinforcement. Across the room, conversations continued. Ideas moved. Opportunities unfolded. And none of it depended on what I had just walked away from. Later that evening, after the conference had ended, and the city had shifted into its nighttime rhythm, I walked back to my apartment alone. The air cooler now, the streets quieter but still alive in that constant, underlying way that had become familiar over time. The building door closed behind me with a soft click. Inside, the space was calm, unchanged, exactly as I had left it. My desk, my notes, the window overlooking the street, everything in its place. I set my bag down, moved to the window, and stood there for a moment, looking out at the lights stretching into the distance, each one belonging to a life that had nothing to do with mine, and yet existed alongside it without conflict. For so long I had believed that my story was tied to theirs, that who I was, what I became, how far I could go, all depended on something I had to earn from them, something I had to prove, something I had to wait for. Approval, recognition, love that didn't come with conditions. But standing there now, in a space I had built myself, in a life that had taken shape without their involvement, I understood something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. I had been measuring my worth against a system that was never designed to see me clearly, and the moment I stopped using it as a reference point, everything changed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. I turned away from the window and sat down at my desk, pulling my laptop closer, opening the file I had been working on earlier, the familiar structure of my work settling into place around me like something steady, something reliable, something that didn't shift based on anyone else's expectations. There was more to do, more to build, more to become. And for the first time, that future didn't feel like something I needed to justify. It felt like something I owned. My phone buzzed once more. I didn't look at it, not because I was avoiding it, because I didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete. And in that quiet, with nothing pulling me backward and everything in front of me shaped by choices I had made on my own. I understood the truth that had been building from the moment I walked out of that house to the moment I walked away from them again. I was never the daughter they chose. But I was the person I chose to become, and that was enough. More than enough.